I learned very early that being quiet was safer than being honest. It began as instinct, not strategy. A tightening in my chest whenever I considered speaking too much, asking too many questions, wanting something that might inconvenience someone else. In our house, attention was a scarce resource, and drawing it the wrong way came with consequences that weren't loud but were lasting. Disapproval didn't arrive as shouting. It came as withdrawal, as distance, as a look that suggested you should have known better. I grew up measuring myself by how little space I occupied. My mother moved through life with urgency, always burdened, always tired, always just one inconvenience away from irritation. Her exhaustion filled every room before she did. It shaped the air, set the rules, dictated who was allowed to need anything. And needing was dangerous. Needing meant delay. Needing meant effort. Needing meant you were not considering everything she already carried. So I learned not to need. I was the eldest child, which meant I became an extension of her long before I understood what that implied. I didn't gradually take on responsibility. It was assigned to me as if it were part of my nature. I was reliable. I was capable. I was the one she could count on. Those words followed me like a shadow, praised by others, unquestioned by everyone. No one asked whether I wanted that role. It was assumed. While other children tested limits, I memorized routines. I knew which sibling needed quiet, which one needed distraction, which cry meant hunger and which meant exhaustion. I could predict my mother's mood by the way she closed the door. I adjusted myself accordingly, trimming parts of my personality that felt inconvenient, hiding emotions that might require explanation. Home wasn't violent. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, and control has a way of convincing you that nothing is wrong. There were moments when I almost believed I was lucky. I wasn't ignored completely. I wasn't unwanted. I was necessary. And necessity can masquerade as love when you don't know any better. Affection came paired with expectation. Praise arrived only after usefulness. When I did well, it was noted briefly. When I failed, it lingered. Mistakes were not corrected gently. They were cataloged, remembered, brought up later as proof of why trust should be limited. I grew skilled at self-monitoring, at anticipating needs before they were voiced, at staying alert even while resting. Peace never felt stable. It felt temporary, like a pause before the next demand. School became my refuge, not because it was perfect, but because it was separate. In classrooms, my value wasn't tied to caretaking. I could be curious without apology. I could raise my hand without guilt. My efforts had outcomes that belonged to me. I didn't tell anyone how much that mattered. College entered my imagination quietly. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't ambition in the traditional sense. It was a private thought I carried carefully, afraid that saying it aloud would break it. College meant distance, yes. But more than that, it meant permission. Permission to focus forward. Permission to exist without justification. When the acceptance letter arrived, I felt something unfamiliar rise inside me. Not excitement exactly. Relief. As if a door I'd been pressing against for years had finally cracked open. I waited before showing my mother. I rehearsed neutral explanations. I prepared myself for practical questions, financial concerns, scheduling worries. I was ready to negotiate. What I wasn't ready for was indifference. She glanced at the letter quickly. Her expression didn't change. "That's good," she said, already thinking about something else. No celebration followed, no acknowledgement of effort, no recognition of what it took for me to get there while balancing responsibilities that were never mine. The silence afterward felt heavier than rejection would have. Later, she began talking. Not about my plans, but about hers. About how complicated things were. About how hard it would be to manage without me. About timing. About obligation. Each sentence carried the same underlying message. This was inconvenient. She never explicitly forbade me from going. She didn't have to. She framed my departure as irresponsible, as poorly timed, as selfish, without using the word itself. Her disappointment was implied, which made it harder to confront. I started to feel ashamed of my excitement. Every preparation step became tangled in guilt. Filling out forms felt like betrayal. Researching housing felt premature, almost rude. I began delaying tasks, not because I didn't want to go, but because wanting felt wrong. Meanwhile, my responsibilities at home increased. Not dramatically, just enough to make leaving feel unreasonable. An extra errand, a longer evening, a sudden plan she couldn't miss, always followed by the same expectation that I would adjust. "You're the only one I trust," she said once. The sentence settled inside me like a verdict. Trust, I learned, was not about belief in my growth. It was about reliance on my presence. She trusted that I would stay, that I would adapt, that I would choose obligation over self every time. And I did. Not because I was weak, but because I had been trained to equate sacrifice with virtue, to associate independence with abandonment, to believe that my worth was tied to how well I could hold things together for others. I watched her leave the house effortlessly, slipping into evenings that belonged only to her. I stayed behind, managing routines, soothing tensions, postponing my own future with the quiet hope that patience would eventually be rewarded. It never occurred to me that patience could be mistaken for consent. Over time, the idea of college began to feel abstract, something that existed on paper but not in reality. I stopped talking about it, stopped imagining details. The dream didn't disappear, it dulled. It folded inward, like something fragile stored away for later. I told myself this was temporary, that life required compromises, that my turn would come when circumstances improved. I repeated those thoughts until they sounded reasonable. What I didn't notice was how much of myself I was setting aside in the process, how quickly adaptation turned into erasure, how often my mother spoke about my reliability without ever mentioning my future. The pain wasn't sharp. It didn't demand attention. It seeped in quietly, reshaping my sense of self, teaching me that my aspirations were optional, but my availability was mandatory. By the time I realized something was wrong, it already felt familiar. The role fit too well. The expectations felt normal. The imbalance was invisible because it had always been there. I didn't yet understand that love should not require disappearance. I didn't yet understand that being dependable should not cost you your direction. I only knew that somewhere between responsibility and silence, I had begun to lose the person I might have become, and no one seemed to notice. Not even me. Words did not arrive in my life as explosions. They slipped in softly, wearing familiar tones, borrowing the voices of people I trusted. They sounded reasonable, concerned, even loving. That was their power. By the time I understood their damage, they had already rearranged how I saw myself. My mother rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority lived in implication, in suggestion, in sentences that ended just early enough for guilt to finish the thought. "You know how much I rely on you. I don't ask anyone else. I wouldn't go if I had another option." Each phrase landed with weight, not because it was cruel, but because it was precise. It placed responsibility directly on my chest while appearing to remove blame from her hands. If I resisted, I wasn't being controlled. I was being unreasonable. If I hesitated, I wasn't tired. I was selfish. Language became a lever. Whenever I tried to speak about school, about schedules or deadlines or the possibility of returning, the conversation shifted subtly. She didn't shut me down outright. She redirected. She sighed. She reminded me of current realities, of unfinished needs, of siblings who required stability, of how difficult things already were. "Now isn't the right time," she'd say, as if time were a window that closed permanently once missed. That sentence followed me everywhere. It echoed when I opened my laptop late at night. It hovered when I read messages from former classmates. It settled into my thoughts until it no longer sounded like her voice at all. It sounded like mine. I began policing myself before she ever had to. If a professor emailed asking why I'd missed another class, shame arrived before explanation. If someone asked what I was studying, my answer shortened, softened, blurred. I learned to speak about my life without committing to it, as if clarity itself were dangerous. Inside the house, my role became cemented. I wasn't helping anymore. I was maintaining. I managed meals, routines, emotions. I absorbed tension so others didn't have to. When conflict appeared, it was quietly redirected toward me, because I was capable, because I could handle it, because I always had. "You're stronger than the others," she once said casually. That sentence felt like praise. It took years to understand it was a sentence of confinement. Strength became my assigned identity, and weakness became forbidden. Exhaustion had to be hidden. Frustration softened into silence. I learned to swallow resentment before it reached my mouth, because expressing it only complicated things. Any attempt to name my limits was met with comparison. You think this is hard? When I was your age, everyone has to sacrifice. Suddenly, my feelings were no longer responses. They were failures of perspective. Pain became something to outgrow rather than address. I started doubting my own reactions, wondering if I was exaggerating, if my fatigue was laziness, if my desire for more was ingratitude disguised as ambition. That confusion was deliberate, even if unconsciously delivered. It kept me compliant. It kept me available. Her words followed a pattern. They were always framed around necessity, never choice. She had to go out. She needed a break. She deserved time to herself. Those truths were unquestioned. Meanwhile, my absence from school was described as flexibility, as something adjustable, as if my future were elastic and hers were fixed. You can always go back, she repeated. Always became later. Later became uncertain. Uncertainty became paralysis. Each time she left the house dressed for an evening that didn't include me, something tightened inside my chest. Not envy, not anger, something quieter. A sense of being paused while life moved elsewhere. I watched her reclaim parts of herself, laughter, spontaneity, lightness, while I stayed behind performing adulthood without its rewards. When I mentioned feeling stuck, she laughed lightly, almost kindly. You're too young to be dramatic, she said. This is temporary. Temporary stretched indefinitely. The most damaging words weren't the obvious ones. They were the ones that reframed reality, the ones that turned obligation into morality, the ones that suggested my compliance was proof of character. You're such a good daughter. I'm lucky to have you. Those statements carried invisible conditions. They praised who I was being, not who I wanted to become. They rewarded endurance, not growth. They subtly warned that deviation would mean disappointment. I began associating love with approval, and approval with self-denial. I became careful with my dreams, trimming them into shapes that wouldn't provoke concern. I avoided conversations that might reveal how far behind I felt. I smiled through questions I didn't want to answer. Inside, a quieter dialogue formed, one that mimicked everything I'd been taught. Don't complain, don't push, don't disrupt what's working for everyone else. I didn't realize how deeply that voice had embedded itself until it started speaking even when my mother wasn't present. It questioned my right to rest. It minimized my achievements. It warned me against wanting too much. Words had become architecture. They built walls inside me, dividing who I was from who I might have been. Friends noticed changes before I did. They talked about internships, opportunities, future plans. I listened, nodded, offered encouragement. When they asked about me, I redirected. I became excellent at disappearing within conversations, present but unclaimed. At home, my mother spoke about my reliability with pride. She told others how much she depended on me, how helpful I was, how she couldn't manage without me. Those stories painted me as essential, but never as evolving. I was frozen in utility, and still I defended her. I told myself she didn't mean harm, that she was tired, that circumstances were complicated. That intention mattered more than impact. But impact is what shapes you. Her words taught me that my needs were secondary, that postponing myself was noble, that boundaries were betrayals, that my time was communal property. I began to feel resentment, then immediately punished myself for it. Anger felt disloyal. Sadness felt indulgent. Even longing felt inappropriate. The weight accumulated quietly, not in dramatic moments, but in repetition, in the daily reinforcement that my value existed in how much I absorbed without complaint. Eventually, I stopped imagining alternatives. Hope requires energy, and mine was already allocated elsewhere. I focused on surviving each week, each obligation, each expectation. The future became something abstract, safely distant. What hurt most was not what she said, but what she never asked. She never asked what I wanted. She never asked what I'd lost. She never asked who I was becoming. Her words filled every available space, leaving no room for mine. And somewhere in that imbalance, I began to believe that silence was easier than being misunderstood, that endurance was safer than honesty, that staying was simpler than choosing myself. By the time I noticed how heavy everything felt, I no longer remembered what lightness was supposed to feel like. The moment everything shifted did not arrive with drama. There was no argument, no slammed door, no declaration of independence rehearsed in front of a mirror. What came instead was exhaustion so complete it felt clarifying. The kind of tiredness that strips away illusion and leaves only truth behind. I remember the day precisely because it was unremarkable. The house was loud in the way it always was. Television murmuring in the background, toys scattered across the floor, footsteps passing without acknowledgement. I moved through the space automatically, performing tasks with mechanical precision. My body knew what to do even as my mind drifted somewhere distant, heavy, disengaged. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. My thoughts felt slow, crowded, tangled. Time no longer moved forward. It stacked. Each day sat on top of the previous one, identical and relentless. That afternoon, while folding clothes that didn't belong to me, my phone vibrated on the table. I almost ignored it. Ignoring had become instinct, but something compelled me to look. The message was short, neutral, administrative. It informed me that due to continued absence and unresponsiveness, my enrollment had been formally terminated. Any future return would require reapplication. I read it once, then again. Then I set the phone down carefully, as if it might break. Nothing happened immediately. No tears, no panic, no visible reaction. Just a quiet stillness that spread through my chest. I continued folding, shirt, pants, socks, each movement deliberate, controlled. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. They scattered outward, touching memories, decisions, justifications I had repeated for months. It's only temporary. I'll go back later. This is what family does. Those sentences no longer sounded comforting. They sounded hollow, like excuses that had expired. I finished the laundry and sat on the edge of the couch. The room felt unfamiliar, despite years spent inside it. The walls looked closer than usual. The air felt thick. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had been avoiding. What if this never changes? The thought landed hard. I imagined another year passing. Then another. Imagined birthdays spent in the same role. Imagined explaining gaps in my life with vague smiles. Imagined becoming someone who only spoke about responsibility and never about possibility. Something inside me recoiled. Not violently, not loudly, firmly. I realized then that I was not merely postponing my future. I was relinquishing it in small, socially acceptable increments. Each compromise had seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The reflection startled me. I looked older than I expected. Not aged, worn. My eyes lacked sharpness. My posture curved inward, as if protecting something fragile. I searched my face for recognition. Who was I now, without the version of myself I'd been preparing to become? That question stayed with me as the evening unfolded. My mother came home later than usual, energized, talking quickly about her night. She barely noticed my silence. She rarely did. I listened automatically, nodding where expected, responding minimally. At some point, she mentioned an upcoming plan. Another evening she needed covered. Another assumption delivered casually. That was when it happened. Not an explosion, not defiance, just a sentence. I can't do this anymore. The words sounded unfamiliar in my own voice. Calm, flat, undecorated. She laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. When I didn't respond, her expression shifted. "What do you mean?" she asked, irritation creeping in. I felt something strange then. Not fear, not guilt, but clarity. A clean awareness that I could no longer afford misunderstanding. I'm done putting my life on hold, I said. I'm exhausted, and I've already lost too much. She began listing reasons, circumstances, obligations, sacrifices she had made, the usual script, delivered with increasing intensity. For the first time, I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue, I didn't rush to soothe. I let her speak. As she talked, something became painfully obvious. She had never imagined an ending to this arrangement. Not because she was malicious, but because she was comfortable. My availability had been absorbed into her expectations, my silence mistaken for agreement. When she finished, she waited for me to back down. I didn't. "I'm leaving," I said. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm not staying like this." Her response arrived as disbelief, then accusation. She questioned my gratitude, my loyalty, my timing. She framed my decision as abandonment. Each word landed, but it no longer rooted itself inside me. Something had shifted too far for reversal. I felt sadness, yes. Grief for what this conversation revealed. But beneath it was resolve. Quiet. Immovable. That night I barely slept. My thoughts raced. But beneath the anxiety was relief. The kind that follows an honest admission after prolonged denial. Over the next days, resistance surfaced in familiar forms. Coldness. Guilt-laced remarks. Heavy silences. The environment became tense, unwelcoming. I expected to feel regret. Instead, I felt present. Each reaction from her confirmed what I had already understood. Staying would require continued erasure. Leaving would require courage, but at least it would be mine. I began taking small steps, making calls, researching options, reaching out to people I'd withdrawn from. Every action felt both terrifying and grounding. Fear accompanied me constantly, but it no longer dictated my behavior. There were moments when doubt crept in, when exhaustion made old habits tempting, moments when apologizing seemed easier than persisting. But then I remembered the message on my phone, the quiet finality of that notification, the version of myself folding laundry while her future dissolved unnoticed. I refused to return to that moment. The breaking point was not rebellion, it was recognition. Recognition that love should not require disappearance. That obligation should not demand forfeiture. That endurance without choice is not virtue, it is survival. I did not suddenly become fearless. I did not resolve everything neatly. What changed was my willingness to keep sacrificing myself for comfort that wasn't mine. I began choosing discomfort over resentment, uncertainty over stagnation, honesty over harmony. Those choices were not dramatic. They were daily, often lonely, sometimes painful, but they were real. And for the first time in a long while, my life began moving forward again. Not because circumstances improved, but because I finally allowed myself to step out of the role that had been written for me. The breaking point was not the end of my struggle. It was the end of my denial. Reconstruction did not feel like rebirth. There was no sudden brightness, no cinematic sense of arrival. What followed my leaving was quieter, slower, and far less graceful than I had imagined during the years I spent enduring. Freedom, I learned, is not immediately comforting when you have lived your life oriented around containment. It feels exposed, unprotected, earned only through continuous effort. The first thing I noticed was how unfamiliar choice felt. Decisions that seemed small to others, what time to wake up, when to eat, how to spend an evening, required deliberation. I was used to reacting, not selecting. My days had always been structured around anticipation and response. Now, silence stretched in front of me, asking to be filled intentionally. At first, that silence frightened me. Without constant demands, my thoughts grew louder. Feelings I had postponed surfaced unevenly. Grief arrived without warning, not only for what I had lost, but for what I had never been allowed to fully want. Anger followed, sharp and disorienting, directed both outward and inward. Sadness lingered, heavy but honest. I did not try to outrun these emotions. For once, I let them exist without apology. Healing did not mean reframing everything positively. It meant telling myself the truth without softening it for comfort. It meant acknowledging that I had been shaped by a system that rewarded my disappearance, and that leaving it would not instantly restore what had been taken. Some days, progress felt invisible. Other days, it felt impossible. But slowly, patterns changed. I noticed how my body responded differently to rest, how my shoulders lowered when no one expected me to manage their emotions, how sleep deepened once it was no longer interrupted by vigilance, how my thoughts began organizing themselves around possibility instead of obligation. I returned to education not as a continuation, but as a reclamation. Walking into a classroom again felt surreal. I was older than many of my peers, carrying experiences they did not yet have words for. At first, I worried about standing out. Then I realized how little that mattered. I wasn't there to compare timelines. I was there to reconnect with a part of myself that had been paused, not erased. Learning felt different this time. Less frantic, more deliberate. I wasn't chasing validation. I wasn't trying to prove resilience. I was simply present, absorbing knowledge without guilt. That alone felt radical. My relationship with my mother changed, though not in the way reconciliation stories usually promise. There was no sudden understanding, no apology that closed the distance neatly. What changed was my position within the dynamic. I stopped explaining my decisions in detail. I stopped justifying my needs. I stopped translating my boundaries into softer language to make them easier to accept. When she expressed disappointment, I acknowledged it without absorbing it. When she implied abandonment, I recognized the manipulation without engaging. When silence returned, I let it remain hers. That detachment did not come easily. It required constant awareness. Old reflexes resurfaced under stress, urging me to appease, to smooth, to retreat. But each time I resisted, something strengthened inside me. I learned that distance does not always mean rejection. Sometimes it is the only way to preserve yourself. As I built a life shaped by my own priorities, I discovered aspects of myself that had never been encouraged. Curiosity without purpose, rest without reward, joy without justification. I laughed more freely, not the polite laughter that fills gaps, but the kind that surprises you mid-breath. I noticed beauty without rushing past it. I allowed myself to be inefficient, imperfect, unfinished. For the first time, my worth was not measured by endurance. Friendships shifted as well. I began choosing relationships that did not rely on my self-sacrifice. I practiced asking for help, even when my voice shook. I learned to receive without calculating how to repay. Trust, once transactional, became mutual. There were setbacks. Moments when doubt whispered that I had misunderstood everything. Moments when loneliness made old compromises seem tempting. Moments when I questioned whether autonomy was worth the discomfort. Each time I returned to one steady truth. Staying had required my absence. Leaving required my presence. That distinction guided me forward. Over time, the identity I had worn for survival loosened its grip. I no longer introduced myself through what I provided. I no longer apologized for taking time. I no longer minimized my ambitions to make them digestible. I allowed myself to be seen as someone in progress. The future, once abstract, became tangible. Not as a perfect plan, but as an open field. I stopped asking whether I deserved more and started asking what felt aligned. That shift changed everything. I did not become fearless. I became honest. I did not erase my past. I integrated it. The child who learned silence taught me sensitivity. The young woman who endured taught me resilience. The person I am now chooses discernment. I know the cost of disappearing. I know the danger of being praised only for what you give. I know how easily love can be confused with obligation when boundaries are never modeled. Because of that knowledge, I live differently. I choose relationships that expand rather than consume. I choose work that challenges without erasing. I choose rest without guilt. I choose voice, even when it trembles. Most importantly, I choose myself without needing permission. That choice is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is made quietly, daily, in moments that seem small but accumulate power. It appears when I say no without explanation, when I say yes without fear, when I trust my internal compass over inherited expectations. I am no longer the person waiting in the background, holding everything together while forgetting herself. I am no longer defined by proximity to others' needs. I am no longer shaped solely by what I survived. I am someone who learned, painfully and precisely, that love must include room to grow. The life I am building is not perfect. It is not free of tension, but it is honest, and it is mine. That is who I choose to be.